When most people think about salmon, they think about dinner. But Alexandra Morton taught us to see salmon as these epic heroes on journeys that connect forests and oceans and allow our ecosystems to thrive. And through her work to change that story, she out-narrated a global industry. The story starts in the 1980s, and Alex had moved to this small Canadian fjord in the middle of nowhere, boat access only, to study killer whales. But what she stumbled into was this battle that looked like a mythic space opera, with a reluctant hero, an entrenched empire, and this fight to save the world as we know it. This is the story of why the wild salmon disappeared, and the heroes who helped bring them back. In the 1980s, salmon farming had the perfect pitch, the perfect story. They were protecting wild salmon from overfishing. They were creating jobs in small coastal towns, especially among Indigenous populations. They were going to feed the world sustainably through this innovative approach. It sounded great. There was innovation, progress, and science was on its side. There was regulatory bodies that were giving their stamps of approval, and investors started flooding in, and governments got excited about the possibility of feeding future populations for generations with sustainable seafood. And so licenses were approved in the thousands. And so the salmon farming companies got to build these business empires on the story of feeding generations. On the surface, it looked like a solution to so many problems, but underneath, something was rotting. We just didn't know it at the time. So enter Alex Morton. She wanted to be the Jane Goodall of whales. She was actually studying as a grad student at SeaWorld in San Diego before all the documentaries came out and we found out SeaWorld's not so good for whales. But Alex learned that quickly by working there. She actually decided to up and move to Canada, where these whales were from, where the families of the whales from SeaWorld were, so she could be close to them and study them. And so she moved to the Broughton Archipelago, this remote area in Canada, and you have to take a boat to get there. So there's only like 100 people who live there. Her and her husband moved up there, and they had kids and a family, and her husband was a documentary filmmaker who made films about whales, which is why they fell in love. But her husband actually passed in a diving accident while filming, and it left Alex to figure out the bills on her own. So she's fishing to pay the bills, and she's studying whales as her passion, but something starts happening simultaneously. The whales aren't coming to BC anymore. And also, the salmon stocks are shrinking. There's less fish to be caught. And both of these are massive problems for Alex. And she knows that they're related because the whales eat the fish. That's why they come to the Broughton Archipelago. So she started a bit of a detective journey to figure out why. And mostly because she wanted the whales to come back so she could study the whales. And after months and months of taking samples and talking to fishermen, she noticed something strange, that wherever salmon farms showed up, wild salmon stocks collapsed. And she said that the correlation was undeniable. And with that information, she had figured out at least the start of the problem, and her scientific mind started digging deeper. In Joseph Campbell's storytelling structure, this might be what we call the call to adventure. She didn't go out looking for this mission to help save wild salmon. She just wanted to study whales. But when salmon vanished, so did the whales. But no one else was acting. No one else was out there collecting this data. No one had the incentive to do so. And she felt this deep desire that she needed to keep moving. That was her call to adventure. The mission chose her. So Alex dedicated all of her free time to doing this research for no money, just her own mission to figure out why this was happening. And she eventually figured it out, and it's so impressive because the problem wasn't this big thing that I think most people were looking for. It was microscopic. It was sea lice.
So there's holes, they're bleeding, sometimes they're stuck to their eyeballs, and the sea lice just ate them to death, and you could literally see the little salmon shrink. People say, oh yeah, sea lice are natural, what's the problem? Well, the problem is there's way too many. Literally billions of larval lice pouring out of every single salmon farm.
And normally a couple lice on a fish isn't a big deal. Like, sea lice occur naturally in the ocean, but these salmon farms were cramming so many fish into a pen that sea lice were able to breed like wildfire. And also, side note, kind of related, that these farms don't farm Pacific salmon. They farm Atlantic salmon. And so they're two completely different species that are not meant to survive in an ecosystem together. So you have all these Atlantic salmon packed into cages, breeding diseases in ways that the Pacific salmon are not used to. And they're right in the migratory paths of the wild Pacific salmon that have been traveling these routes for millennia, and it's built into their DNA, into their brains to travel this exact route. And so when salmon are born, they're born in the river, and they have to travel out of the river to get to the ocean. And when these juvenile salmon, this is like baby salmon, are reaching the ocean, they're met with this mob of sea lice, and they couldn't survive it. When they would travel past the fish farms, they were getting covered in these parasites, and they were bleeding. The things were like stuck to their eyes. They're gross, don't look, shock warning. And through her sampling, Alex recorded sea lice levels in a few places that were 30,000 times what normally should exist in the ocean in that area. 30,000 times the amount of sea lice. No wonder the salmon were covered in sea lice. Now, Alex is a trained scientist, so she's able to conduct this research, and she's taking photos of everything, and she has the data. She's able to prove that this is why this is happening, but nobody would listen. She wrote letters, she made calls, she tried to book meetings with different government agencies, with her government representatives, but nobody would listen.
And so I wrote my first letter, and the answer back was basically, "Dear Ms. Morton, there's no problem. Don't worry. Don't look."
People on the ground were listening. Fishermen knew what was going on. Indigenous communities were listening to her, desperate for a solution. But the people with power weren't listening. And normal folks weren't listening. Like, we didn't care. The facts just weren't enough to shift the story. The salmon farm still had the advantage in the storytelling, right? They had that narrative solvency. They had the economic story going for them. They had the moral backing. They had experts that were backing up their story. It takes a lot to break through and flip the script. She realized that the numbers weren't going to be enough, and she needed a new strategy. So she went back to what she does with whales, which was try to listen to them communicate with each other and be their voice. And Alex thought, well, I can't listen to salmon talk, but I can see what they're trying to say, and I'm going to try to speak for them and tell their story. And this is where Alex's narrative genius really flourished. And I think it was kind of her first time having to do this. It's a bit of a fake it till you make it situation of telling a story for a species. She realized that people, much like myself before I heard her story, thought of salmon as products, as food. And she helped reframe the conversation so we thought of them as characters. Not just characters, but heroes. I think that's a good storytelling trick, is if you're telling a story about something that isn't a human, to try to give it human quality. And Alex was able to tell the story of salmon, of how the self-sacrifice, the epic journey that they're on, the sense of adventure, and we started to fall in love with salmon.
Because here's an animal that wants to go on to thrive and feed 100 species, and, it's good for the economy and the forest.
She explained that their mission helps us all by them traveling up the rivers, providing food for an entire ecosystem that we know and love on the West Coast. This is going to be a little bit strange, but hear me out here. It might be a reach, but think of a hero we know and love, or know at least, Luke Skywalker. He starts just as a farm boy and is called to adventure and leaves his home on a dangerous journey that he has no idea what he's getting into. He ends up facing impossible odds and risking his life to try to bring balance to the Force.
The walls are Don't just stand there, try and brace it with something!
And so that's kind of like salmon, because they're born in streams and just days old, they make this dangerous journey towards the oceans.
Use the Force, Luke.
It lasts for days, weeks. They get out into the open ocean just as these tiny little things without any guidance from anyone. It's all just pre-built into their brain. And they travel for miles through the Pacific Ocean and spend anywhere from 2 to 4 years depending on the species of fish. And something then gets triggered in their brains to return home on a mission. And they face all this danger to get back to the exact same spot that they were spawned, the exact same river. They travel up the river, dodging bears, jumping over fish ladders and crazy waterfalls to get back to where they spawned. They spawn and they die. And in that return and in that death, they fuel an entire ecosystem, feeding the bears and their bodies fertilizing the forests. Without them, we don't have the forests and the ecosystem that we have here on the West Coast. And Alex helped us understand that. She shifted the story to make the salmon the heroes and something worth protecting. And it wasn't just Alex. Like, if Alex watches this video, she's probably going to hate that I made her the hero of this story, because she did have lots of allies, lots of helpers, lots of guides that come along for any hero in a story. And a lot of them were Indigenous in this story, the Indigenous communities that had known and respected wild salmon for generations. And also commercial fishermen who had seen wild salmon stocks plummet and threaten their livelihoods. I've already talked about Joseph Campbell, but a lot of his work is what inspired Star Wars. Like, George Lucas talks about reading a lot of Campbell. And Joseph Campbell always says that the hero finds allies. And Morton found her allies, and she was building a rebellion. But even with this shift in narrative, it's going to take time for that story to build and reach a critical mass that enough people are believing it to shift the power structures. And because it didn't happen quickly, in 2002, there was this massive decline in pink salmon stocks. Let me get the numbers. Went from 3.6 million to just 147,000 in 1 year. 96% crash. That's crazy. That's near extinction levels. And so Morton knew that she needed to take the fight global and go talk to these fish farms directly. If the government wasn't going to do anything, then maybe the fish farms who advocated for feeding generations would do something about the wild fish in the neighborhoods, in the waters that they were operating. And so she flew to Oslo and stood in front of the board and the shareholders of one of the fish farms. And she told her story. And she asked, would you move some of these farms? And the chairman actually responded, but laughed and said, we're not going anywhere. And so back to those Joseph Campbell story structure moments. This was Morton's ordeal. It's the moment that the villain shows its true face. You actually know what you're up against now. Every myth has this moment where the hero realizes it's not just general resistance you're up against. The obstacle has a face and even a name. And that laugh and that reply seem so simple in the moment, but that's actually what got the narrative to really shift. It was the moment that the fish farms really flipped from being the heroes to the antagonists of this story. Because how could they be the saviors if they weren't even willing to listen to the problems that were going on? By shutting that door and laughing in her face, they revealed themselves as the antagonist. And every story needs a villain. So that's really when it caught on in the public's minds, when the story started to become clear that it was these fish, the heroes, fighting against the fish farms. But the fish don't have a voice, so we need to be their voice. And that's what Alex was teaching us. But it wasn't just science for her anymore. It was a full-on rebellion. And in 2017, her and Hereditary Chief Alfred, who I've actually met, cool guy, they occupied a salmon farm. There was a big group of them, and Alex joined, and for 280 days they slept on that farm, occupying it to draw attention to who the true heroes and who the true villains of this story were. They were cold, they were tired, they were scared, but they kept going for 280 days. By the way, these farms, they're just floating fish nets. Like, you're basically, when I say they occupy the farm, they're sleeping on like a dock or a boat floating out in the middle of nowhere. And shortly after that, the narrative really started to take hold and shift in people's minds. And these things take too long. It was 2020 when the movement saw its first major win. The Canadian government announced that they would phase out salmon farms in the Discovery Islands. This is where Alex had been pushing to get them out of the wild salmon migration routes. And the results were stunning. Within just 2 years, salmon stocks were back in record numbers. That 96% drop in pink salmon had come back. In 2023, a study showed that there was a 95% drop in sea lice in those areas that they had removed the farms.
By the next spring, those salmon farms were empty, and the pink salmon that are coming back today were traveling through waters with no sea lice, with no disease, no bacterial infections, and they looked beautiful. And they're coming back now in huge abundance. That to see the natural world pick up around us because we respected it, it just gives me so much hope that we can learn to live in these ecosystems and not destroy them, and benefit from the bounty and the generosity.
And that brings us to today, 2025, when the Fraser River is seeing record salmon numbers since the 1970s. We thought salmon were gone from the Fraser River because of pollution, because of logging, because of fires, because of mudslides. We had every excuse for why there was no salmon in the Fraser River anymore. But they're back. Our heroes, the salmon, are returning. So Alex Morton and all the other people that have helped. Turned statistics into characters, numbers into stories. That process made people care enough to fight back, and it worked. The salmon are back. And by the way, Alex is now happily studying whales again after completing her mission. For me, this story proves something simple, that data can inform us, but it's stories that move people. And when the right story is told in the right way, has the power to take down empires.